I'm Sarah Steffens. I'm the Worker Power Director for the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's briefing on putting working families first in review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. So before we start, I have just a few brief housekeeping notes. So first, we are going to dig deep into policy discussions today, but we will not engage in electoral or partisan conversations during the session. Second, we have enabled automatic closed captioning. So to turn those on, go to the meeting controls toolbar at the bottom of your screen and click captions and then show captions. And then third, we encourage you to ask questions of our incredible panel throughout the event, throughout the next hour. So you can drop your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And at the end, we'll get to as many questions as we can. So let's, in the interest of time, let's jump right in. So first off, I'd like to introduce Arthur Stamoulis. Arthur is the Executive Director of Citizens Trade Campaign. That's the national coalition of labor, environmental, family farm, faith and consumer organizations that came together during the original NAFTA debate in the early 90s, and they've been working together to improve U.S. trade policy ever since. So Citizens Trade Campaign has been hosting regular cross-sector coordinating meetings on the USMCA review since late last year, and its C3 partner, the Trade Justice Education Fund, has been conducting grassroots outreach. So Arthur, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak with you today. So jumping right in, President Trump promised that the USMCA was going to bring jobs pouring back into the United States. He said that the deal was necessary because of the massive trade deficit under the original NAFTA agreement. We're more than 5 years into the USMCA, and now we have the data. The cumulative U.S. trade deficit with Mexico and Canada over the past 5 years is almost double what it was in the 5 years prior to the USMCA taking effect. The deficit is up 192.7%, which is significantly higher than the increase in our deficit with the rest of the world over the same period. Under the USMCA, we've seen import surges in everything from autos to aerospace to agriculture. Companies continue to ship jobs to Mexico to take advantage of ongoing worker rights abuses, abysmally low wages, lax pollution controls. And on top of that, the USMCA continues to be packed full of provisions that expand corporate power and threaten public interest policies in a variety of areas. So the USMCA renegotiation is an opportunity to address many of those problems, but that's only going to happen if members of Congress, labor, civil society come together and demand that working families' interests come first. So I do have some slides. I'm not sure if they're on the screen now, but we can go to that second slide, why the USMCA, please. And so while that second slide's coming up, I'll say, there are all these various trade negotiations going on right now. There are all these Truth Social posts flying around on trade on an almost daily basis. Why does our coalition focus in on the USMCA first among all those trade issues? There are a few different reasons. Number one, because the USMCA review is mandated in both the USMCA text itself and in the implementing law that was passed by Congress, we know that, ready or not, this is going to happen. This is as predictable as anything in Trump trade land these days. Number two, unlike other trade deal making, there are at least some minimal requirements for public and congressional consultation that we can take advantage of. And number three, Mexico and Canada, the United States' two biggest trade partners. Beyond that, whatever individual provisions are agreed to in the renegotiation are likely to be replicated in future agreements. So the USMCA is a big deal, both literally and figuratively. Next slide, please. So what's decided during the USMCA review? If we zoom out, there are basically two buckets of decisions that countries need to make. The first is what changes to the pact are going to be made. Countries have the opportunity to propose amendments to the agreement and to consider them together during the review, which is why this process is quite literally a renegotiation. The Trump administration has already indicated that it is going to be pushing for changes, so the possibility of no renegotiation seems quite slim. The real question is, are proposed changes going to help working families in your districts and beyond, or are those changes going to hurt them? And then the second decision that countries are asked to make is whether to extend the USMCA for an additional 16 years or to meet again in a year and revisit the question of extension then. If countries extend the USMCA for 16 years, any renegotiated text agreed to at that time will be in place until July 1st, 2042. If countries choose to punt, the USMCA remains in place, but an additional review happens again a year later. And that's sort of punting, the 1 year delay on a decision to extend, that can take place for up to 10 years. Countries do need to make a decision on whether to extend the pact at some point, but they have until July 1st, 2036 to do that. And so one question worth asking is, do you think your constituents are going to get a better deal in 2026 under President Trump and the current Congress? In which case, try to lock in that 16-year extension now. Or do you think your constituents could get a better deal in 2027 under a new Congress, or perhaps even further down the line under a new administration altogether? In either of those cases, not locking in a 16-year extension may be the way to go. Now, in some ways, like raising that question now is obviously putting the cart before the horse. We don't know yet exactly what amendments to the USMCA President Trump and other governments are going to propose, but it is helpful to understand there's no requirement to accept a deal now if we don't like the terms. Next slide, please. So let's quickly go over some of the key elements of the USMCA review timeline. Since early April, the administration has had at least a rough sketch of its plan for the USMCA review on paper. It hasn't shared that plan with the public, but it has supposedly briefed key committees in Congress about it. From what we heard at the time, the details were very sparse. Then earlier this summer, the US, Mexico, and Canada together conducted the required tripartite 5-year reviews of two of the USMCA's most important chapters, the labor chapter and the environment chapter. The USMCA's Environment Committee published its 5-year review on the USTR website. Anyone can see it. It is 1 page long. It cites the United States praising our law enforcement measures at the southern border as one of our biggest environmental achievements. It makes no recommendations whatsoever for improving the USMCA's environmental provisions. The USMCA Labor Council's 5-year review, we finally learned just last week, was also completed months ago. As far as I know, no one in organized labor was consulted. And I can't tell you what's in that 5-year review because unlike the environmental review, that labor review doesn't seem to have been published. Supposedly Senate Finance and Ways and Means have received the labor review. If any of you have a copy, assuming it isn't classified, and why would it be, I would love to see it. Please send it my way. Next up in the timeline, under the U.S. implementing law, USTR is required to initiate a public comment period on its USMCA review plan. We heard this morning that that comment period is likely to be in the Federal Register tomorrow and then to be open for 45 days. It's worth remembering, for all their other trade negotiations, USTR has explicitly said there will be no public comment period, meaning there will be no official public input. The public can weigh in on the details of each trade agreement only after it's done. With the USMCA review, Congress passed a law, which President Trump signed, saying that there has to be a public comment period. So we want to take advantage of that. Next, after the public comment period, the administration is required to inform Congress of what changes to the USMCA they're going to propose, and also whether or not they're going to ask for that 16-year extension. That notice to Congress is due by January 2nd. And finally, the 3 countries are required to notify each other of the amendments they plan to propose no later than a month before the final USMCA review meeting, with a deadline for that meeting of July 1st of next year. So that's a lot of information. 2 key things to know. Number 1, the Trump administration isn't going to go into those final negotiations and then decide what their positions are. They're deciding on their positions, now, and that's why we need to engage now and can't wait to the final stages of this process. And the second thing to know is that the dates on this slide are by and large deadlines. Things could always happen on a faster time scale. Next slide, please. So one way that labor and civil society groups have been getting ready is by collecting signatures on a cross-sector letter spelling out the changes needed for the USMCA to deliver its promised benefits to working people in the US, Mexico, and Canada. We released that letter with over 680 organizational signatures on June 12th in anticipation of those labor and environment chapter reviews so that US negotiators could go into those meetings knowing civil society's core demands. Signers on the letter include the American Federation of Teachers, Postal Workers, CWA, Machinists, SEIU, Unite Here, United Auto Workers, Carpenters, UFCW, Mine Workers, Steel Workers, CLU, LACLA, Jobs of Justice, many others from labor, 350, the American Sustainable Business Council, Blue Green Alliance, Earthworks, Food and Water Watch, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, League of Conservation Voters, Mighty Earth, Sierra Club, Sunrise, others from the environmental movement. And to save time, I'll just say, many family farm, consumer, faith, human rights, civil rights, other organizations, again, over 680 groups in total. Next slide, please. So the joint changes that all these groups are pushing for start with provisions that would help stop the offshoring of good paying jobs. I'll let Kathy and Catherine detail the changes needed for that, but very top line, we're pushing for stronger labor and environmental enforcement mechanisms, protecting people's rights, and removing corporations' major incentives to offshore work. We're pushing for provisions that raise wages across the region, requiring the goods exported and imported under the deal, particularly in key sectors, are produced by workers making a fair wage. And we're pushing for anti-circumvention measures, including strong rules of origin to ensure that more of the parts traded in North America are produced under the strong labor, environmental, and wage standards that a renegotiated pact will hopefully enforce. Next slide, please. So the letter, which I can paste in the chat or circulate afterwards, also calls for provisions that strengthen rural communities, that address root causes of economic displacement and migration, that tackle climate change and other environmental challenges, that fully eliminate investor-state dispute settlement, and that safeguard access to medicine. On that last point, folks who are around during the first Trump administration may recall their first draft of the USMCA that Trump asked Congress to pass would have expanded pharmaceutical monopolies and raised medicine prices. Congressional Democrats said no way to that language. They got it removed. Congressional engagement on these terms absolutely matters. Next slide, please. One other thing we're pushing for is the removal of harmful digital trade language that wasn't in the original NAFTA, but that Trump managed to sneak into the USMCA. At the time, Speaker Pelosi actually made a last-minute attempt to get that language removed, but frankly, our coalition didn't have much expertise in big tech's trade agenda at that point. It wasn't one of the major issues that we or many others were actively discussing. It was only after we started really digging into that language and we learned what a threat these provisions are to personal privacy, data security, AI accountability, right to repair, anti-monopoly, both at home and globally, that's when we really started campaigning against them. And in 2023, after several years of working with partner groups to educate policymakers about this issue, the Biden administration wisely chose to withdraw US support for Trump-era digital trade proposals at the WTO and also in the context of other trade negotiations. Unfortunately, as we've seen in recent months, President Trump has pretty much made advancing big tech's agenda the top issue in his bilateral trade negotiations. Rather than use whatever leverage his tariffs have created to push for changes that would create jobs for American workers or build more resilient supply chains, he's instead demanded that countries provide tax breaks for big tech billionaires and, more worryingly, make policy changes that undermine privacy, online safety, AI oversight, and more. And these policies aren't just bad from a consumer perspective. They're awful for working people in the digital economy. One of the reasons corporations want the ability to ship your personal data all over the world without regard to privacy and data security standards is so that they can store and process that data wherever is the cheapest for them to do so. And just like with manufacturing offshoring, they're looking for low energy costs in the form of lax pollution controls. They're looking for flexible labor pools in the form of weak labor standards, just-in-time contractors with fewer rights than actual employees, for example. And of course, they're looking for cheap as dirt wages. So entrenching this digital trade model would only serve to accelerate offshoring. On top of that, the digital trade attacks on AI accountability policies also impact people in the workplace. More and more people are increasingly hired, fired, supervised, not by middle manager human beings, but by algorithms. So for more on all that, I highly recommend reading the AFL-CIO's white paper on a worker-centered digital trade agenda. And last slide, please. To wrap up my part, what are we asking your offices to do? First and foremost, if you haven't already, please get your boss to sign Representative DeLauro's letter on the USMCA review. That's endorsed by the AFL-CIO, the steelworkers, the machinists, UAW, Sierra Club, Public Citizen, Rethink Trade, others. It echoes many of the demands being made in the 680 group civil society letter. If you need a copy of the DeLauro letter, shoot me an email at arthur@citizenstrade.org. I'll send you the text, the quill link. I'm happy to answer any questions about it. My understanding is that letter will be closing this month, so that time to act ideally is today. We really, really need your support on it. And then once your boss is on that letter, another thing your office can do is help draw attention to the public comment period, which again is expected to open tomorrow. It should remain open at least through October. If you want to send an email to constituents or supporters, we can help with language. If you want some links or sample text for social media posts, we're happy to provide that. And if your boss is really gung-ho and is ready to do an in-district event, an online town hall, an op-ed, anything like that, just let me know. We'll do what we can to support you. My phone and my email are below if you have any questions. Thanks again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Arthur. That was great. And we do have the Q&A function open, but in the interest of getting through everyone, I'm going to, we'll take the questions at the end. So let's turn next to Kathy Feingold, the director of the AFL-CIO's International Department. Kathy is a committed and passionate advocate, a strategic campaigner, a policy expert with more than 20 years of experience in trade and global economic policy and worker, human, and women's rights issues. She, since 2018, has been the deputy president of the International Trade Union Confederation, the organization that represents 200 million unionized workers worldwide. And in 2020, she was appointed to the Independent Mexico Labor Expert Board. That's the body created under the USMCA to monitor and evaluate labor law reforms and worker rights compliance in Mexico. So take it away, Kathy.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and hi to everyone. Thanks to Arthur for that really helpful framing of where we are today in that timeline. Just to go back a little bit, in 2019, the AFL-CIO actually endorsed the USMCA. This was sort of a big step for the AFL-CIO. We had worked a lot with our congressional allies to secure significant improvements to make sure that the flawed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, would be transformed. And so that's why we also fought for the sunset clause that you're hearing about, why we're in the current moment that we're in. We didn't want to get locked in. And as we're seeing, we're in a very different economic and political moment. And so this review is incredibly important because as we heard from Arthur, there are still a lot of challenges that we see. The economic impacts that we had hoped for across all three countries are not what we had hoped for them to be. The other innovative piece of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement that I think both Catherine and I can talk about is the rapid response mechanism. It was the first binding and enforceable mechanism. Traditionally we had labor chapters, and in the initial NAFTA agreement, we had a side chapter that was unenforceable, not binding. Corporations knew they could actually break the rules without really being held accountable. And so the rapid response mechanism has become a really important tool that I'll address in a few moments. Under the USMCA, the government of Mexico committed to fully implementing fundamental labor law reforms to address the decades-old system of corruption and violence. The system in Mexico had been created under way back when, where unions, business, and the government sort of created a bond. And what that created in Mexico was a system called protection contract system, which basically meant in the trade context that a multinational corporation from the US could go down and basically give money to a union and say, you know, take care of things, make sure there's no freedom of association, make sure there's no real organizing, make sure that as our profits go up, there's no collective bargaining so that workers actually benefit from the improved productivity and profits that are happening. And so, as Arthur mentioned, wages still continue to be a major problem in Mexico and across the three countries. So the commitment under USMCA by the Mexican government to improve the labor laws was advanced. There was a huge focus on the protection contract unions, and we knew the interconnection. If you couldn't address the fact that there was a system in Mexico that was preventing workers from improving wages and working conditions, then it was going to be much harder for workers in the US and Canada to bargain higher wages, right? You were always going to have this imbalance of wages. So the rapid response mechanism and the commitment to improve the labor rights system in Mexico was incredibly important. But unfortunately, as these years have shown, and as Arthur reflected, the USMCA is not delivering on its promise to address systemic labor exploitation. And we heard the numbers from Arthur. Major multinationals like Stellantis, John Deere, Nabisco, they've continued to offshore production. And workers' wages remain just a tenth of their American counterparts. And at the same time, the Mexican government has failed to completely implement the key pieces of the labor reforms while slashing the budget of the institutions charged with enforcing the labor laws. So as we go into this comment period and this review period, here are some of the key areas that the labor movement would like to see addressed. And then I'll look for my colleague Catherine from the Steelworkers to go more in particular sectorally. One, the continued offshoring of good jobs. The US continues to lose tens of thousands of good jobs, particularly in manufacturing, making everything from Oreos to automobiles to high-tech aerospace. This is a huge challenge, and management still uses in organizing campaigns the threat to offshore, right? And so this is going to continue to be a key issue that must get addressed. We heard there was no real progress on the wage gap. The rapid response mechanism, the idea was really that if in the rapid response mechanism, if workers' freedom of association was violated, then, you know, this mechanism would go into force. But what we experienced was freedom of association leading to collective bargaining, leading to higher wages. This will take a very long time if we are going to see systemic change in the wages. And so we do need the rapid response mechanism. We need it to be more boldly enforced, but we also need to look at other ways to ensure that we can make progress on the wage gap. Let me go a little bit more into the reform, the Mexico labor law reform, which we think is critical. It addresses, as I said, longstanding obstacles to labor justice and democratic governance in Mexico. There was supposed to be, the reform law gave a 4-year transition. So we recognize this was not going to be overnight like any labor law reform. And there were supposed to be some deadlines. What was supposed to happen under this transition was the establishment of independent government institutions and courts responsible for labor relations and labor justice, and a mandate that all existing collective bargaining agreements would be submitted to a free and secret vote by the workers covered to determine whether or not the majority supported the agreement. This was really important because there were a lot of collective bargaining agreements that workers had never seen. They did not even know that their workplace was covered by an agreement. And in many cases, they had a protection contract, which meant, if anything, the agreement just reflected what was in labor law, right? So that as, again, productivity had gone up in their factories, they were working hard, and there was more profit being made, they had no tools for real collective bargaining. So this was a really important part of the process. So some of that has happened, and we did see a review of some of the CBAs. The institutions required to operationalize the labor law reform were established over 3 phases, and they have started to work. Unfortunately, we saw under the last administration in Mexico, real support for this process. But the 2025 Mexican budget reduced funding for these labor institutions. It's part of a broader reduction to narrow the federal deficit in Mexico. So we saw about a 32% reduction in the budget for this labor law reform. So we're extremely concerned about what will happen with the labor law reform. So that's one thing we're going to be focused on. To date, about 39 cases have been initiated by the U.S. Department of Labor under the Rapid Response Labor Mechanism, which has resulted in real wins for workers, including wage increases, reinstatement of illegally dismissed workers. So this, again, we want the rapid response mechanism. It needs to be expanded. It cannot really get to scale yet to address the amount of labor rights violations that Mexican workers are facing. It is so egregious and systemic that the RRM is one tool, and we need more tools to be able to address these issues. The other issues that the labor movement will be focused on is the forced labor import ban. The USMCA required all three parties to adopt and implement a ban on the importation of goods made in part or whole with forced labor. And although all countries have adopted some form of an import ban, Canada and Mexico have done very little to actively implement it. So we are going to be looking at that. I think the Canadians have reportedly stopped one shipment of goods. I don't think Mexico has detained anything. There's a huge issue around transshipment and investment. I'll allow my colleague Catherine to talk about that, as well as what Arthur mentioned, the need for stronger rule of origin to boost North American manufacturing and raise labor standards in key sectors, especially like auto. We're also concerned, as Arthur laid out, around digital trade. And I just want to put a finer point on what Arthur said. When the initial USMCA was being negotiated, and I was part of that, we were very focused on developing the rapid response mechanism and on the sunset clause and some other issues. I don't think any of our movements were effectively focused on the digital trade. And I think, again, to Arthur's point, there was not a lot of deep expertise about what this really meant, both in manufacturing and in the service sector, like call centers and other sectors. And so I think the digital trade is an area we absolutely must be focused on, especially in the current deregulatory environment that we're in, where this administration is giving a lot more power to the tech industry. This is going to be an area that I think is even more important than when we started negotiating the USMCA. And then again, the labor movement is going to be focused on the fact that there's weak environmental standards. We didn't get the equivalent of a binding enforceable agreement for the environmental piece, right? We got one for labor, and we did not get one for the environmental. So we really need to look at what would it mean if somebody is dumping toxic waste or actively violating environmental protections. I think this is a really important area that we need to look at. And again, we don't need side agreements. We need binding and enforceable. The last point I'll make, Sarah, is really the issue around how negotiations, our expectation on how the negotiations should happen. This is a whole new environment as we're seeing how trade and tariff is happening right now without Congress being involved in the way it should, without stakeholders being engaged. During the first USMCA negotiation, the labor movement was actively engaged. Some of us are cleared advisors. We were engaged on various parts of the discussion on how to create the rapid response mechanism. What would it look like to deal with wages, rules of origin? Let me be clear, there is no transparency in the current trade discussions. And so one concern I have going forward, despite the fact they are opening up this federal registry notice and the importance of submitting our comments, we don't have the traditional model right now of a lot of active engagement with labor and other stakeholders and other industry players to ensure that this review effectively reflects the priorities in this given moment of those stakeholders. So I think we really need to look at this accountability issue, because if not, then we can all submit a bunch of comments that we're not sure where they go or who are we holding accountable to respond to them. And I think those are the kind of questions we need to be asking. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. Next up, we have Catherine Wallace, She is the legislative representative for the United Steelworkers. Catherine brings to our conversation today nearly a decade of experience in international trade. She's served in various roles in the Department of Commerce's International Trade Administration, and her portfolio with the steelworkers also includes appropriations, healthcare, atomic energy, paper regulatory reform, and LGBTQIA related legislative issues. Catherine, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks, Arthur and Kathy, for what a beautiful foundation for me to go. And thank you all for being here at 4 p.m. And being riveted, I can tell, even now without your cameras on. Happy USMCA Public Comment Day to all who celebrate. What an exciting development that we got to have the notice tomorrow, but we got to see that it's coming out today. For us who love process, as a former Fed who love a career Fed, I love a little process in such a chaotic time that we've been having within the trade world. So just to see a Federal Register notice the day before, it's a small win. I think we can all celebrate. If you're not familiar, the United Steelworkers we're the largest manufacturing union in North America. We represent about 850,000 members and retirees. And while we're commonly known as the United Steelworkers, our full name is the United Steel, Paper and Forestry, Rubber Manufacturing, Energy, Allied Industrial, and Service Workers International Union. And I only say all of that because we have a diverse array of workers. We're not just steel. And so when we have a conversation about trade exposed industries like these, it's important to note that we have more than just steel workers that we're taking into consideration in the USMCA and what you're hearing. We have even nuclear waste removal experts. We have biomedical researchers at the University of Pittsburgh. And while we're the largest steel union, we're also the largest aluminum, mining, chemical, pulp and paper, cement, and oil union as well. So while these are trade exposed industries, what that means is that the sustainability of our family supporting jobs is highly reliant on the global economic conditions, especially taking into consideration trade and the USMCA. Trade determines whether it's fair or not, determines whether our mills stay open, whether our communities are hollowed out, whether our kids can find jobs there, or whether they have to move away. We saw firsthand with NAFTA, the first 10 years after NAFTA was imposed, we lost about 850,000, if not more, jobs in the manufacturing sectors. I saw Adam from EPI, thanks for that research. What that truly means for our union is if we have 850,000 members and in just 10 years, NAFTA decimated 850,000 manufacturing jobs or more, that's our entire union. And as my brother Raj from the UAW would say, free trade agreements have been one of the most effective union busting successes in our history, right? So if we as progressive folks believe that unions are important, thinking about fair trade is also important. Thinking about NAFTA 2.0, USMCA is incredibly important. So that's what is at stake for our union, and is what's at stake for Democrats or progressives within Congress. And while we supported USMCA renegotiation, Kathy mentioned we were heavily involved in trying to get some improvements from NAFTA to see these labor provisions like RRM, to see for steel and other industries, some rules of origin, which I'll talk about in just a minute. We did see those improvements. We are asking for radical change within a renegotiated USMCA. But I will pause just a second just to talk about some of those improvements because that is important as well. Kathy mentioned this just a little bit, but I wanted to bring a little bit of color. So one of the examples of an effective RRM case was tire workers in San Luis Potosi. They won an average of 30% wage increase, 4 million in back pay, and that's 20,000 workers just at that facility. And also we saw that impact around 60,000 workers, not just that facility for the Goodyear case, but across RRM in the many cases that Kathy mentioned. And so we are seeing that effective change, but there are far more than 60,000 workers in Mexico. And we're still continuing to see offshoring. So in EPI's research recently, we've seen manufacturing workers in Mexico earn just a paltry $2.76 an hour, which is what Kathy mentioned, that 1/10 of US wages. And on the environmental side, the story is just as bad. Companies know they can dump pollution, cut corners on safety. They're skirting rules in a way that we don't tolerate here. And the environmental chapter is not very enforceable. It's toothless. So while they're saving on wages, they're also saving on environmental lower standards. The closure of the Goodyear plant in Gadsden, Alabama was a really great example of this. The plant ran for more than 90 years and once employed thousands of our union members, but in 2020 it closed, shutting down and taking away those hundreds of jobs that were left at the time. And while the company specifically noted that it was cost competitiveness, which ultimately led to that closure, those hundreds of workers in the community that were shut down ultimately were devastated by that move and the exploitation of the workers that occur on the southern side of the border. And so while some may in long term say, you know, well, we have to abide by these rules, we have to abide by labor laws, we have to abide by environmental laws, from a union perspective, we see environmental and labor laws as a benefit to our workers and communities. And we hope that any agreement will also take into consideration that both sides of the border should incorporate those, as well as all of our Canadian members on the northern side of our border. Gadsden is just one example. We've seen it in autos, we've seen it in food processing with a very often cited example of Oreos, in steel and aluminum, but we also see it on the collective bargaining table. So even when the facility is not moved, it is often a threat at the table that we could move. If your wages go up too high, we won't be able to continue to operate here in the way that we do currently. We hear that from companies all the time, which leads us to a race to the bottom. We believe that unless USMCA is fixed, it's that race that working people will keep losing. Another way that USMCA needs to improve is through the rules of origin. While we've seen some of the rules of origin be effective or at least be improvements over NAFTA, these standards that decide whether a product really qualifies as North American need to be improved so that they incorporate more sectors, but also a higher threshold. In plain terms, the rules are too weak. Between 2020 and 2023, Chinese direct investment in Mexico jumped 288%. Exports of key industrial goods from China to Mexico surged anywhere from 160 to 900%. And it's not about Chinese investment in Mexico. This isn't an anti-China stance. It's about using Mexico as a backdoor into the United States to skirt other trade enforcement measures that are in place. The United States currently has more than 250 anti-dumping and countervailing duty unfair trade cases against Chinese imports. There are also numerous Section 301 and 232 investigations which have been upheld or implemented by administrations that are both Democrat and Republican. We know that China uses anti-discriminatory or discriminatory and anti-competitive practices in order to tilt the playing field, and using Mexico as a backdoor in order to circumvent these practices defeats the purpose of putting them in place in the first place. On the technical side, the rules of origin for autos and critical minerals they're outdated. We would like to see critical minerals be incorporated as well for rules of origin. And while we were supportive of USMCA in its original negotiation, we know that there's been an evolution of trade behaviors, but also the way things are made in the past 5 years. And we imagine that even if the agreement were entirely successful at all of its aims 5 years ago, it also makes sense that many things have changed, including the development of EVs, the way in which auto bodies are created and shipped. That despite billions in U.S. investment in EVs and batteries, we've seen that auto imports from Mexico have nearly doubled between 2020 and 2024. And loopholes have been letting non-originating metals through. For example, stamped aluminum body parts made from foreign ingot can still qualify for duty-free treatment, which undercuts our aluminum smelters and fabricators and workers who depend on them. That's why we're calling for a comprehensive review of the rules of origin, and also look at the way in which noncompliance is currently seen, or in recent history has been seen, as a cost of doing business. Currently, there are IEEPA tariffs in place, which have encouraged compliance with USMCA as the only duty-free exemption for tariffs into the United States. However, we know that IEEPA tariffs are not really the most, they don't have a lot of longevity, and we are uncertain about their future. And we've seen that with legislative or litigation. And so in the long term, we'd like to see ways in which the MFN rate may be considered as part of the negotiation to encourage compliance with USMCA. Especially our brothers and sisters at UAW have spoken about all of the different ways in which importers will see the very low 2.5 auto rate and ultimately bring autos or auto parts into the United States and just pay that rate rather than comply with the USMCA. Currently, that is not the rate because there is a tariff on non-compliant USMCA goods, but we imagine it may change in the future and would like to see some certainty within rules of origin. So where does that leave us? With the more than 1 trillion goods moved under USMCA, we know it's not just a side agreement, it's a very impactful agreement, and that this potential renegotiation shouldn't just be viewed as a check-in. We're looking for a broad array of changes that help to lift communities up that have been gutted and to protect the industries that we do have left. We don't want to tinker around the edges, and we hope that ultimately we will be able to use the agreement and rules of origin and RRM expansion to environmental chapters, sectoral rules of origin, so a rebuttable presumption for RRM. But we can get into that with any of the Q&A that you have as well. Ultimately, we want to convey to those who are negotiating the USMCA that the USMCA must work for workers, because ultimately, when workers are strong, democracy is stronger. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Catherine, and also to Arthur and Kathy. What a great panel this has been. I want to pause for a moment and stop our recording before we turn to questions, so we can just run through things freely and quickly.